Hello and welcome to Erupt, the home for how businesses can scale and transform. Throughout this podcast, we aim to inspire and educate to help you and your business thrive. Across the course of our episodes, we'll be interviewing industry leaders to uncover some of the challenges across the world of work. We aim to give an insight into some of the fastest growing organisations across HR and technology. Please follow us on our journey to erupt and elevate your business. In today's episode, we discuss the topic of embracing change and learning after lockdown from an HR leadership perspective with Paulo Pisano from Booking.com.
Paulo, absolutely delighted to have you with us today for this conference. I know we were talking about it previously, that it's maybe been 2 or 3 years that we've maybe discussed having you involved, and finally it's happening. But what a time, to be involved with you, and quite a few things to discuss, I suppose, in terms of the journey that you've been on over the last sort of, how long is it since you joined Booking.com? It was right
a little bit over 1.5 years, coming closer to 2 years now.
Okay, so what would that be? So February 2020?
Beginning of March 2020.
And we all know what happened.
Perfect timing, right?
Yeah, not what you were probably expecting, right? As you just land into one of the biggest jobs in e-commerce in the world. Here you are, growth agenda, ready to go, and bang, pandemic. I mean, how did you sort of react to that? How do you change your strategy, to then think about, right, this is what we need to deliver?
Yeah, I mean, look, it was, it's interesting, right? When I joined in, I was in conversations with Booking at the back end of the prior year. And as you described, everything was about growth and expansion and a pretty ambitious agenda. I remember already in the beginning of 2020, as we started seeing some of the first signs of what became the pandemic in Asia Pacific, I remember discussing it with some people at Booking, and not only, but other colleagues I have in the sector. And invariably, everyone would say, don't worry about it. The travel industry is global. We've seen this before. If something happens in a region, travel will shift to different regions. If you have a global company, you're in a good position, nothing to worry about. And those were the famous last words, as they say, right? I joined on the very first week of March, and 2 weeks later, so I had 2 weeks in the office. And on my third weekend, basically, since joining in, we had to make a very big decision, which was around closing all the offices we had around the world, over 200 offices to be closed, and transitioning everyone to working from home. Something that I know that all organizations have gone through at one time or another. For us, we were, I'd say, pretty early movers on that. It was a big decision to be taken, right? Do we do it now? Do we wait until we have a bit more clarity? I think we did the right choice, but it was a hard one, right? Because when you think about the logistics, right, and the complexity for an organization, that like Booking, but many other organizations that have a pretty office-centric culture, right? Offices are a place where people have deep connections, fun. You have interesting offices. A lot of the culture goes around people not just spending time together at the office, but having a drink or a meal after work, and moving that onto working from home effectively was a very big shift. It was a shift from a logistical standpoint as well. Do people have the equipment? Do we have the bandwidth, the networks, and everything that's needed to put things in motion? I keep thinking, right, if we had this pandemic 10 or 15 years ago, maybe it wouldn't have gone global as fast, but imagine the challenge we'd have had from a technology standpoint, right? Because now we have a lot of very good technologies available to get people to collaborate and to work together. So it was a very big shift for us. And, talk about priorities, to your point, right, of changing tech. For us, it was massive, right? Because I'd say the first half of the year of last year was focused on fundamentally crisis management, right? So although if you think about Booking, it's a marketplace, it's a tech company, but we're fundamentally focused on enabling travel, right? So accommodations, flights, car rentals, taxis, dining, attractions, everything that, if you think about, was most deeply affected by the pandemic. So the first half of the year was really around crisis management. Now, how do we transition the global workforce to remote working? How do we identify non-essential spending or investment? How do we secure cash flow? Do we need to raise money in the market to be, kind of more robust as an organization in the future? We don't know how long this is going to go for. How do we protect and support our partners and our customers, right? All of those questions were very much part of what we had to focus in the first half of the year. And then we had to divide our attention, right? We had to divide our attention because you're focusing on the crisis, but you still need to run a robust, business as usual operation, right? You can't just drop everything. So almost like overnight, you had to split the attention of the organization and figure out a way where you can still keep things running effectively while we have a number of our colleagues starting to focus on something that's completely new for us, right? How to manage under the crisis. So big shift.
Yeah, no, 100%. I'm really interested as a new leader in that organization. Often when we're delivering huge change management, what enables us maybe to deliver that change is the relationships that you've built within the organization and the knowledge of the company, and maybe even your own function sort of capability. That must have been so much harder when you're new into role and obviously you have a view on the business, but you haven't cemented those relationships yet. You're a highly experienced leader. How did you tackle that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big challenge, I must say, right? Because that no matter how many times you shift organizations, onboarding takes time. It takes time, takes persistence, takes seeing people often, building trust takes time as well. So what I'd say for me is that it changed the nature of the onboarding I did. Rather than doing a more traditional onboarding where you will go pretty wide in the organization, perhaps quite, kind of superficial, right? Not too deep, but you really connect with the organization on the surface across the board. What I ended up having was an onboarding that was very deep, narrow, but very deep, right? Mostly focused on everything that was essential for the organization to continue to operate and to survive through something that we didn't know how long it was going to take. So it's interesting because a few months later, it was visible how I had enormous depth on certain characteristics of the organization, but I just didn't know enormous amounts of people or many parts of our business. And I think it was, for me, just relatively easy to accept. And that was absolutely the right thing to do, right? It was very much driven by the need, right? And the need was very clear. What we needed to do for the organization was difficult to argue against. So yeah, it was tougher in some ways. I'd say now, kind of getting closer to 2 years in the organization, I'm only now in 2021 doing more of the regular onboarding that I would have normally done in the beginning of my job last year.
So obviously you make that response to the crisis, you put in place a plan that thinks going to deliver the best outcome for the business in such challenging times. Mm-hmm. Hopefully we're able to look back a little bit now. Maybe the worst might have hopefully be behind us. If you were going to do things again, what would you think would be the key things that maybe you tackle slightly differently? And what were your biggest learnings as a human resources leader from this period?
It's a very interesting question, right? Because when I think about learnings, right, just to take perspective, right? Frankly, I think we're still pretty early in the journey, right? If you think about it, we've been in this for a little bit under 2 years in most of the Western world, and it feels like a long time from a personal standpoint. But if you think about prior global crisis the world has gone through, 2 years is not long, right? Prior, pandemics, world wars, or you name it, right? It's a lot longer. So I'd say you got to look at your learnings with some humbleness, in my opinion, right? Meaning you're certainly learning a number of important things, and I can mention a couple that have been important for us, but we can't kind of tick the box and say we are out of this and on we move forward. I think there's certain things that only true perspective and time give you kind of a different angle, right, on what is it that you've truly learned. For us, I don't think that the learnings were as much around decisions that we would have made or we would make differently in the future, because I think we got generally pretty good results on the things that we did, but I think they have to do more with process, right? Looking at how we've gotten to those decisions or those results. So Booking is a highly data and insight driven organization, right? If you look, and you and I have talked about this before, if you look up at A/B testing, for example, right? Booking has been a reference and a benchmark, in the last decade. So we have that, kind of obsession with data, with insights, and what we do as part of the culture, not good or bad, but just informs the culture. We're also a relatively low hierarchy organization, with a lot of debate and a lot of dialogue, which, again, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it's part of the organization. In a crisis situation, you often have less availability of good quality data, right? And you have less time to debate and to discuss, right? So you have those pressures, which can make something that is a strength or part of your culture not be fit for purpose on what you're going through, right? And I'd say for us, there are some learnings around how to set up parallel processes where you can deal with the different needs, right? So you don't have to fundamentally change the culture of the organization, but you have to be able to develop flexibility so you can be fit for purpose when the conditions around you change. And that's something that was, I think, a very important learning for us. It's, this ability also, I think, with the pandemic, it was very easy to identify this was a very difficult and very different situation. But what if you don't have something like the pandemic that's so obvious, but you have more subtle circumstances that change around you? How do you adapt to that? And at which stage do you acknowledge that the way you're operating might not be good enough for that new situation? That is, I think, one of the fundamental questions that we were invited into exploring, and we're still exploring, right? We're still trying to learn from that.
So looking forwards, hopefully, I completely agree with what you're saying. The pandemic isn't going away. We have to obviously learn to live with, it, and obviously plan into the future now with the impact that it's created and the legacy that will remain with us for a number of years, I'm sure, at least. But if you were going to take some learnings from the last 15, 18 months and embed them as part of your strategy moving forwards, what would you say the good things aren't, but what are you taking forwards from this last 15, 18 months that, will stick within your people strategy for the future?
Yeah. So I'd say three things mostly in my mind. So first is communication cycles, right? Now, more frequent, more dialogue and interaction, more leadership visibility. We know those things made an impact in our organization. They make an impact in general, like might sound obvious, but if you look at the way in which you have your cadence of communication, more often than not, you'll realize that as a broadcaster, so to speak, it feels like you're busy communicating. But if you look from the receiving end, there are instances where people just don't hear enough from their leaders, right? Don't have enough visibility on what's going on. So one is definitely around communication, cadence, frequency, and how you do that, the whole kind of communication cycle. The second bit for us is the notion of, less is more, right? So, we were forced to identify the critical levers for impact in the organization, not just in HR, but in a number of different areas, right? You had limited resources, you had limited time, you had limited availability of people. So you had to figure out, where do you put your energy for highest impact. And I think this is very present in the conversations we have in the company. I think the more you succeed and you grow as an organization, the more you tend to complexify the organization, right? You have more products, you have more services, you have more people, you have bigger structures, you have more geographies in more countries. You need to upgrade your systems, you have to change your processes. All of that breeds complexity, right? And therefore it breeds lack of focus. So relentless effort to simplify and to prioritize can make a big impact. And I'm not saying that just relentless focus on simplifying is something easy. It's not even something you get to. It's more that you're constantly trying to develop that muscle, and you will generate enough of a counterbalance to the complexification of the organization that I think can make a huge difference. For us, that was an important learning, and we're still working on it. And the last one is flexibility, as I mentioned before, right? So in the way of working, in the ability to shift direction or adapt more effectively. And for that, I think having strong PMO slash change management capability is very important, and it's something also that I haven't seen many organizations do particularly well. So I'd say that that element of change management, that element of creating flexibility, would be kind of a very important learning for us as well.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you with what you're saying there. I think this notion of agile that, was originally, I think, employed traditionally within technology functions is becoming more and more pervasive within certainly leading people functions. And it's interesting to hear your language of agility that I think, obviously you're embodying into the future. Do you see that, not only your own people function, but do you think people function of other businesses into the future? It probably was already evolving, right, in terms of what the components are, more specializations in certain areas like data that you mentioned, communications. But do you think that the people function has changed forever now? And what do you see the key components of a successful people function into the future that may be slightly different from 18 months ago?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, James, because I'm not sure the pandemic has effectively changed the people function or the expectation organizations have the people function forever. I do think that it demanded some specific things of the people function in a way that perhaps were never as evident in the past. That's just the nature, right, of the crisis we've been dealing with. And perhaps the positive thing is that it evidenced organizational structures and mindsets in the people function that are not as employee-centric as they should be. The problem, I think, with our function, right, in HR is that it grew as more of a product organization, right? And all the movement we've seen in the past couple of decades towards centers of expertise, which I think was very positive in many ways, ended up also generating a little bit of an over optimization of the organization as a product organization. And when you do that, it's very common for us HR professionals to fall in love with our products, right? And with our tools and with our processes. And then you build a process that's supposed to fix one thing, and then you see another problem that it could help fix as well. And you say, oh, with a small adjustment, I can make it solve this second problem. And then you add a third and a fourth. And next thing you know, you have processes that have become very complex. They're trying to solve for too many things, and they don't solve for any of them particularly well. So I do think, yes, there are learnings from the situation we're going through now that, if applied by HR teams and organizations, can help us make a big shift, but they won't necessarily do so. It still demands effort, in my opinion. And it's this effort to transition into a mindset of kind of outside in, of looking at what is it that the business is trying to do, and then how your people are going to help the business do that, people, capabilities, all that good stuff, and then building from there. Sounds obvious, but the majority of our teams in HR aren't necessarily designed that way. And I think that's going to be an important part in how we shift the function into the future. It's having that the same level of focus and perhaps obsession many businesses have with their customers, you need to build with your organization and your employees. For me, that's one thing that's fundamental. And the second one is simplification. Is that, again, just like the rest of the organization, we tend to, because we grow in the function typically as process people, every issue we see, the natural instinct is to create more process. and how do you counter that? There are many challenges you have in the organization that will not be solved by process or by organizational design. They'll be solved by something much more subtle, right? By the kinds of people that you hire, by the mindset that you're trying to develop in the organization, by the way that executive teams work effectively with one another. So just some of my thoughts on that.
I love that. And I heard you talk about outside in. Obviously, we've got Professor David Ulrich talking at the conference, and I think some of his thinking there is really, really fascinating. I'd like to ask your opinion about a debate that we've been having in some of our sessions about the nature of employee engagement, and this piece about employee experience is becoming more and more of a thing. Arguably now, there's a conversation that people demand more potentially from a potential employer. I don't know if you agree with that than they did pre-pandemic, and that maybe employee purpose is potentially changing as well in terms of the key motivators that bring somebody into a job, but also make them stay there into the future. I don't know how much you thought about that, but what's your perspective on this whole topic?
Yeah, I think a lot about that. And not only that, I'm engaged in a number of conversations with some of my counterparts in other companies with our teams. It's interesting because the crisis we've been going through, I think like probably any crisis, right, is invited reflection, right, introspection. And anytime I think we introspect, we pay attention, right? We raise awareness around what we do. We allow ourselves to apply more intention on what we do. And this leads us to either recommit to the path that we've been taking, or maybe we adjust course a little bit, a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left. Or sometimes we reconsider completely, right? We realize that we're not doing what we want to be doing, what we're supposed to be doing, or whatever, and we change course. If I think about booking as an example, we have a hugely international workforce. And I mean, not just international that we are in lots of countries, but we have a lot of expats. A lot of people have chosen to move away from their countries to work somewhere else with us. So we saw some colleagues as a result of the pandemic choosing to return back home, to be close to their extended families, for example, and perhaps to sacrifice career or to accept to go to a more limited, kind of a market or whatever it is. We've seen some people move to other organizations, for example, smaller organizations that were more like booking 10 or 15 years ago, because they wanted something simpler, or maybe they wanted to repeat something they really enjoyed in a part of their career and they wanted to do it again. And then, of course, we saw many more people recommitting to their work, either by doubling down on what they're currently doing or exploring new opportunities internally, right? So we've seen the full spectrum. And so that's one part of it. And I think we're seeing that, right? The great resignation people are talking about, et cetera, has some elements of that. I think some of the elements of the great resignation is that people just having gone through a really tough time where we felt that not much around us is something we can impact, we can affect. You end up focusing on what is it that you can affect. And I see a lot of people changing jobs because they can, just simply saying, I just need to do something different and something new. And in many cases, I think that may be a good thing if it's done for the right reason, if it's done with introspection. But in many more cases, I've seen people doing it on autopilot and then realizing that it didn't fundamentally change anything. Actually, they ended up in a place that they didn't like as much. And I'm seeing, for example, even at Booking, but I've seen in other organizations, more boomerangs already than perhaps we've ever had before. People going to try something, then realizing actually I quite liked where I was, or there was a different angle I didn't explore. And I think if you add that to the market pressure you have as well, right? We are in an employees market. So there are a lot of options, right? There's a lot of temptations, a lot of money flowing through, startups, the classic, they don't even call them startups anymore. They're pre-IPO companies, right? So all of that creates a seductive environment for people to do different things. Are people's expectations fundamentally different? I'm not sure if they are fundamentally different, but I do think there is a little bit more intention on it, a little bit more introspection, and what is it that I want to do, rather than following the herd onto the big famous brand or onto kind of the capital. I want to work in London or New York. I think some of that has been debunked, so to speak, and people are being a bit more intentional. Long term, I think that's a great thing, because ultimately it should lead to a more intentional workforce, right? To more engagement, because people have more consciously chosen the organization they want to work with. It's going to take time, but I think it might be a good thing in the long term.
Fascinating. And also just on that, I've seen more and more job titles of heads of employee listening. And we talked about it earlier about how you believe one of the big sort of outcomes of change is communication, continuous feedback loops that you mentioned. I mean, personally, I think that the pressure on leadership, the pressure on management has evolved in a way that probably didn't exist pre-pandemic. In terms of, you've got people in the office, you've got people at home, how do you manage them? How are you aware of what they're doing? How do you performance manage? Does performance management exist anymore? There's debates about that. Performance motivation, I've heard it called now, which is really interesting. But how have you how have you put into practice this listening capability, feedback loops, and how important do you think that is as a function into the future?
Yeah, I can't help but smile a bit that I hadn't heard this title before, by the way, the head of employee listening. I can't help but be slightly conflicted by that, in that, there's certain things that I think you can't kind of outsource, right? I think that one of the very definitions of what a good manager or a good leader is a great listener. Now, you need to listen to the organization, you need to be listening to what's being said, what's being felt, and what's not being said as well tells you a lot. So from my standpoint, our effort, for example, is much more around guiding and supporting managers and leaders to listen in more effectively in the organization, so that there can be true dialogue and not just broadcasting for the organization, then creating separate structures to take care of the listening. We have, like many other organizations, we do engagement surveys and whatnot. And quite frankly, most organizations have a lot more data than they know what to do with, than they actually extract value from. So my focus with our teams is really to start learning how to use what we have more effectively, to really kind of support and guide managers to be closer to their people, to ensure that our HR advisory or business partnering function is as close to to the businesses, right, ear to the ground as we can. I think longer term, that's what's going to make the most difference, rather than creating specific silos or separate capabilities for the listening. The tough thing about that is, how do you do that effectively when you are remote, right? And for me, that's the big challenge we're facing is, when you're at the office, you walk around, you see a group celebrating, you go there, what's going on, you have a conversation, you see someone's got a sad face, you can check with them, how's it going, what's cooking. You can have a level of impromptu connections and dialogues that is impossible to have on a remote environment, right? We've seen a lot of developments to try to make it better to doing it remote, and there's a lot of great practices and creative ways in which we even do random meetings, discussion groups, etc. All those things are good, but it will never, I think personally, I think as long as we're human, we are social animals, and there are certain things that are possible in person socially that are not possible over video. And I think that's going to be part of the challenge we have on the hybrid work environment, right? We're at or we're moving towards.
Unfortunately, I think we've only got a couple of minutes left. This session's gone by so quickly. I think what would be really interesting for me, and I'm sure for the audience here as well, would be just some final sort of thoughts of reflections maybe about what you think is still to come. And maybe if you had one or two pieces of advice that you could choose to any leader looking forwards now, what you would give to that leader. I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, look, I mean, the what's still to come, who knows, right? I do think that there's still, as I mentioned earlier on, although I am very optimistic about the prospects ahead of us, right? We have vaccines, we've seen the efficacy of those vaccines. Now we're starting to see also more advances in treatment. I think countries and governments in general are starting to get their act together, right, and get a bit more aligned on what to do to contain. We're still going to live with this not normal or new normal situation for longer, right? So maybe it's a year, maybe it's a couple of years, maybe it's longer. So I go back to points we've talked about, right? The ability to keep flexible, to create that flexibility within the organization so you can be adaptable is very important. The second thing is to get the awareness to know when you need to adapt. When is a situation different enough that it calls for a different approach? Listening to what's happening, listening to your people, listening to the organization, what's happening, listening to the market, you know, as we have to do as organizations. So this exercise of listening, but not outsourcing it to a part of the organization, but developing that muscle group, that capability in as many people in the organization as you can. By the way, the listening is not even just for managers or leaders, it's for each other, right? We've all been talking about how social media has polarized opinions, etc. I would claim you have a lot less listening happening there as well. So if we want to engage in a more open, more constructive, more inclusive environment in the workplace, and not only, you need to start with listening to what the other person's saying, to where they're coming from, you know. So I'd say that is going to continue to be pretty fundamental. And as we, I think, trail through a period that is difficult, we need to do that better than ever, because I think good listening leads to empathy, leads to compassion. And if we can have a little bit more of that, then I think we can go a long way, and we can not just survive, but we can thrive in a very difficult environment.
This podcast was brought to you by Annapurna Erupt. If you enjoyed this episode, please visit our Go Erupt website to get involved in our regular podcasts, video footage, and live events throughout the year. Thank you for listening.